Episode 12 picks up in Canada where the Waterfords are being held in separate rooms and Mrs. Waterford is allowed 5 minutes with Fred Waterford. And as soon as he sees Serena, he starts vowing to seek vengeance against those that did him wrong. And she says, look, you've got to stop worrying about that, all right? And you've got to stop worrying about me. You've got to start worrying about yourself because I'll be fine. And it's becoming obvious to everybody in the room that Serena sold him out. He looks at her and says, what did you do? And she says, I guaranteed that I would see my daughter. And Fred looks at her and says, I just feel bad that the daughter has you as a mother. So Serena walks out of the room because, sticks and stones. And per the arrangement with Canada, she's going to be allowed to see baby Nicole for 1 hour with the social worker present in the room. And Moira brings baby Nicole in, but she doesn't just bring her in without saying something. She has a few choice words for her. Just like with Luke's meeting a couple weeks ago, Moira gives her the dirtiest look and tells her that I'm June's friend and this is June's baby. She then turns to the social worker in the room and says, if you need extra diapers, they're in this pouch. And Serena cuts her off and says, hey, I'm sure she'll be fine. And Moira looks at her and says, well, who even are you? Who even are you to her? You're nobody to her. I'll tell you who you are. You're always going to be the woman who held other women down while your husband raped them. And your husband also raped me too. Jezebel's, yeah, he raped me. The guy from the American government tries to jump in and say she's out of line, but Moira just looks at him and says, fuck you. Eventually, Moira does leave the room for Serena's visit, and it doesn't start off so hot. Baby Nicole is crying quite a bit, and the social worker says, it's, probably a little strange or dangerous situation. So Serena starts trying to comfort Nicole, saying, Nicole, it's mommy. And the social worker cuts her off and says, you can't tell her that. You're going to confuse her. And it's so fitting because this is exactly what Gilead told June about her daughter, and now the shoe is completely on the other foot. Now, while the meeting with Serena and baby Nicole was going down, a meeting between Fred Waterford and Luke was going down. Luke goes in the room and says, I know what you did, and at the end of the day, you're always going to be a man who was betrayed by his wife. Fred kind of chuckles and says, well, what about you? What about your wife? She's not here, and she's not coming here. The reality is the June Osborne that you knew is dead. Gilead changed her. I changed her. And when he says this, Luke freaks out and punches him right in the face. Luke walks out of the room, and you got to imagine it felt pretty good to finally lay his hands on Fred. So there's your Canadian update, but back in Gilead, June is armed with a gun and waiting for soldiers to come in, but when the door opens, it's not soldiers, it's Mrs. Lawrence. She's a little taken aback that June is holding a gun in her face, but says that soldiers are downstairs and they need some tea, and Commander Lawrence just thought that maybe the Martha in the household could use a little help. So June obliges and heads into the room with the tea, and you're overhearing a little bit of the conversation between Commander Lawrence and a couple of the other commanders. And the other commanders are trying to pressure Commander Lawrence into a military attack against Canada because of what happened with the Waterfords. Commander Lawrence is obviously very hesitant to start a war over this. And eventually the commanders leave. And as Commander Putnam is leaving, he looks at June and says, you're probably the only one who's happy about this. Finally, everybody leaves the room and it's just June and Commander Lawrence. And Commander Lawrence tells June exactly what happened with the Waterfords, but he also tells her, as far as everybody's concerned, Commander Winslow has simply disappeared, and they're blaming the Canadian government for this. They think because Canada took Commander Waterford, they must have taken Commander Winslow as well. So Lawrence says, you just got off the wall and away with murder all in one morning. That's a pretty good morning, right? But the good news doesn't stop there because June also learns that Billy from Jezebel's has agreed to her deal. So he's going to supply the plane and she's going to supply the art, and the plane's going to arrive in 7 days. Later that day, June heads to the market and sees Rita and is telling Rita about the plan with the kids, and Rita says that she's proud of her and she'll help in any way possible. And this echoes the sentiment of pretty much all of the handmaids and Marthas in the town. But later that day, Mrs. Winslow along with Mrs. Putnam arrive at the Lawrence household to pray for the safety of Commander Winslow, but also the safety of the Waterfords. So June has to escort Mrs. Lawrence into the room, and shortly after Mrs. Lawrence arrives, Mrs. Winslow asks Commander Lawrence if there's any leads to the whereabouts of Commander Winslow, and he says, no, not that I'm aware of, and she says, well, please try to find him because I can't be kept up in a house with 6 kids. They're going to end up taking some away. And Mrs. Lawrence jumps in the conversation and looks at Commander Lawrence and says, oh, well, we can take some. We can take some with us. We have room, right? Commander Lawrence keeps covering for her, and luckily for them, it doesn't seem like the women are catching on to the fact she keeps saying we can take them with us. The 2 women get up and leave, and now it's just June, Commander Lawrence, and Mrs. Lawrence in the room. And Commander Lawrence is telling them that even with the new clearances back, because Commander Winslow and Commander Waterford are gone, so they've returned his clearances, unfortunately, you have a bunch of trigger-happy politicians that want to go to war with Canada. And they're even talking about closing the border. And if they close the border, that means no plane, and no plane means no escape. So he asks June if she can move up the date, and June says, no, it doesn't really work that way. It's 7 days days from now. You got to keep the border open. If this plane arrives early, it's not going to look normal. We're not trying to garner any suspicion here. And while they're having this conversation, Mrs. Lawrence is trying to leave the house because she's seeing kids outside that she can, quote, save. She's saying there's a kid over here I can save. There's a kid over here I can save. What about the kids over in the school? And finally, June just grabs her and yells at her and says, shut up. You cannot tell a soul about this. Commander Lawrence tries to jump in and kind of protect his wife a little bit, but June isn't having it, and June says, you should have had her shut up a long time ago. Now, Mrs. Lawrence reluctantly agrees and just slowly heads up to her room. Later that night, June passes by Mrs. Lawrence's room and notices that she hasn't brought in her food, so she grabs it and opens the door, and there she finds Mrs. Lawrence has overdosed on a bunch of pills. Now, initially, she goes to save her, but thinks better of it and realizes that maybe it's better off for everybody if Mrs. Lawrence isn't in the picture. So she slowly backs out of the room, closes the door, and puts the tray down for a Martha to find her the next morning. And sure enough, the Martha does find her. Mrs. Lawrence is dead, and now we're planning a funeral. Now, the good news is, because of the fact she died, Commander Lawrence has a sympathy angle for him, and the politicians have agreed to keep open the border. So, June's plan is still on.